A reading from the book of Psalms, chapter 29, verses 1 through 11. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Worship the Lord in holy splendor.
The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty.
The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh.
The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forest bare. And in his temple all say, Glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as King forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace.
Hear what God is saying to the people. Thanks be to God.
I would like to begin the sermon this morning by saying thanks to Dr. Williams for this opportunity to be with you in worship this morning. And also thanks to the chapel worship planning team and all the people who were gathered on earlier this morning to make sure everything was working. I know that it takes an awful lot of work to make this happen. So I want to say thanks to everyone who had a hand in preparing this chapel service today. And also want to thank each of you for taking time to be here this morning. And I do pray that our time as a whole together will be a blessing to you, and also pray that I will offer the words that might be helpful for you this morning. I do believe God has a sense of humor. So I noted a couple things as we prepare this morning. One is that we're on different time schedules. I noticed that for the header for our worship service today, it mentioned ordinary time, and some parts of the Christian church see this as ordinary time, and some parts of the church see this as Epiphany, where Epiphany is a season, and this year it's a long season where God is in the work of revealing God's self to the world. And so I'm sort of playing on that a little bit with the sermon today about how God is revealing God's self, particularly through the person of Jesus Christ. So even if it's ordinary, God's still revealing, because that's part of what God does. I also think it's interesting that preaching on a psalm where it talks about cedars and the twisting of oaks and God's power displayed in the natural world, that on this day, we're having trees taken down at our house. And so you may hear occasionally the sound of saws or large thuds. As long as the picture holds, everything's still good, but I do apologize if there's any distractions from that. I've gone through some thank yous. I also want to say thanks for asking me to preach on a psalm. Now, my guess is that this will either please or deeply disappoint Doctors O'Brien, Lovelace, and Appler, depending on how this sermon goes. But I have to admit that preaching on a psalm scared me, and this particular psalm baffled me. But in the end, preparing for this returned me to two theological foundations that I will share with you at the end of the sermon. Now, I noted that this task scares me a little. I love preaching from the lectionary, but I am generally a Gospels preacher. Not a gospel preacher, mind you, if that has any kind of negative hellfire and brimstone preacher kind of connotations for you, but a gospels preacher, meaning that I like to preach from the life and teachings of Jesus as they come to us from the gospels. Now, this doesn't mean that I ignore the Old Testament, least of all the Psalms, because I generally preach from the lectionary, which includes those readings from the Old Testament in general and the Psalms in particular and the epistles, and they can add to the readings from the gospel. When we read all these texts, and particularly due to the way the lectionary is constructed, when we read the Psalms and the Old Testament passages, they offer us background and context to more fully understand Jesus and how Jesus' audiences and the recipients of his healings might have understood, or why they might have misunderstood him and the work that he was doing. But Dr. Williams asked me to preach on the Psalm, so I took on this daunting task. And let me also say that I found this particular Psalm challenging because I believe in participatory worship. Liturgy, the work of the people, should be what we're doing, and our worship together should be preparing us to act in the world when our worship service is ended. I like to tell my students that at the end of every sermon, the preacher should be able to answer two questions. From your sermon, what do you want the congregation to know? And from your sermon, what do you want the congregation to do? Now, I have to say that after studying this psalm, not only was I confused by it a little bit, especially by different translations of it, but I was also uncertain as to how I wanted to encourage you, the listeners, the congregation this morning, how to encourage you to act, what to encourage you to do. And the problem is not a lack of action in the psalm itself, far from it. This psalmist exhorts, the psalmist proclaims, and God, particularly through the voice of the Lord, is doing mighty deeds that symbolize that he is different from all other beings. This psalm is alive with action. So let's look at some of those actions. First of all, the psalmist exhorts his noun of address, or her noun of address, to ascribe, ascribe, ascribe. Now, this is a verb that we don't think of or use very often, at least I don't. I mean, think of a hypothetical conversation you might have with someone who asks you how you're spending your time right now. Typically, when people ask what we've been doing, what we've been up to on a Wednesday lunch break, we might say, I caught up with some friends, or I made sandwiches, or I'm eating something special because I'm on a post-holiday diet. But even if we were telling them we went to chapel, that we went to worship, would we likely say that we've been ascribing? If we were to tell people that we were busy ascribing, would they know what we're talking about? And let's be honest, would we know what we're talking about? Ascribe is a rather fancy translation for a Hebrew word that can simply mean give or provide. And I do think in this day and age, using terms like ascribe in biblical translation can be a little problematic. Imagine using that in your hypothetical conversation again. What'd you do over lunch? I went to chapel. What'd you do? I ascribed praise to Yahweh. Now, my guess is that your conversation partner's next response is not going to be, great, can I come with you next time so I can ascribe praise too? But what I do find interesting, and the fact that all commentators point this out, is who the noun of address is. Who is the psalmist telling people to ascribe praise to God? The psalmist isn't talking to Judah or Israel or the people of the coastlands or to all people. The psalmist is talking literally to the sons of gods, some kind of supernatural assembly or an assembly on the spiritual realm. These are the ones who are to be giving praise to God. And they are to do this because as the psalmist goes on to tell in symbolic fashion for the main body of this psalm, Yahweh is the ruler of the created order. The psalmist makes this claim in contrast to the theological understanding of their neighbors. Their neighbors saw their many gods as actually having to contend with the forces of nature. Yahweh, however, made and rules these natural forces. The God whose ruach, whose spirit, whose wind hovered over the primordial waters and who gathered the seas together so that the dry land could appear, this God still rules these. And furthermore, Yahweh does this with Yahweh's voice, not with chariots or thunderbolts or physical interaction with the created order. Through the voice of Yahweh, the natural world is ordered to rest or to reset or to be broken or to move, even to the point of making mountaintops dance and buck like young wild animals, all according to the will of Yahweh. The voice of Yahweh does these things. And then in the last verse, the psalmist declares that the Lord also gives strength to God's people and blesses God's people with peace. Interestingly, it's Yahweh, the totality of Yahweh, not the voice alone of Yahweh, that accomplishes these things. Or, depending on the translation and interpretation, the psalmist prays that Yahweh will do these things. And that's what leads to my question. What is it that I should do in response to this psalm? The psalmist has addressed others about giving praise to God. The psalmist has recounted the actions of God. The psalmist has possibly prayed to God. And what am I supposed to do? And how am I, as the preacher, supposed to encourage you? Let's face it. It's one thing when we look for signs of how God is mightier, more powerful than the idols we might make or that the cultures around us construct. But it's another thing altogether when we see the destructive power of the natural world and then want to either hold God accountable for this destruction or attribute this destruction to justifiable divine wrath. I'm sad when I hear people look at the ever more powerful and destructive storms, which science tells us are being supercharged by human activities that heat up our climate, and then ask, why is God doing this? Why is God sending these hurricanes and floods? And I cringe even more when I hear religious leaders who claim that an event like Hurricane Katrina is God's wrath that was poured out on New Orleans because of the sins of the city or the sins of the country. So God's in charge of and rules nature, and at times nature is so destructive. So what do I do? Preparing for this sermon has taken me back to two key principles that have helped me deal with a lot of life. The first is this statement: I don't understand all I know about this situation. I don't understand all I know about this situation. This was a phrase that Alan Reep, who was the assistant band director at UNC Chapel Hill, used. He said it a lot, and it's really helped me with a lot. Because as this psalm points out, the intersection of life and perspectives and interpretations and experiences can be confusing. I know things. I believe things. Like I believe that God created the heavens and earth. And I believe that God does not willingly afflict God's children. And yet hurricanes, which are part of God's creation, hurts people who are also part of God's creation. I know these things, but I don't understand how they can be true at the same time. I don't understand all I know about this situation. I believe that God set up creation to work in certain ways. And I believe that God at times may intervene so that things don't work in those normal ways. And we might call those miracles. And I also know that God doesn't always perform the miracles I might want, even diligently pray for. All these are things I know, but I don't understand all that I know. Just acknowledging that this can be the case, that God can do and often does do things that are beyond my limited human understanding, can be a humbling and, I believe, ultimately helpful act. God is simply beyond my comprehension. And the second principle that this passage takes me back to is this: I need Jesus. I need Jesus. The psalm proclaims Yahweh's power. It recalls the Spirit in creation, and it is still, for me, incomplete. The only ways that I can really work with this psalm and my conflicting interpretations and understanding of it is in the context of, and in comparison with, and in contrast to the understandings of God, who also revealed God's self in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the both and in the sermon title. Jesus is the fully human, fully divine bridge between the God of creation and the creature, at times blessed by and at times suffering within creation. Jesus is the both and within the words revealing God. Those words are intentionally ambiguous. Do those words point to God as the subject or the object? Does the word revealing function as an adjective describing God, meaning that God is a revealing God? Or does the word revealing function as a verb, noting what the scriptures and our lives can do, which is revealing God? In Jesus, it is both and. Jesus is the revealing God who is himself revealing God. This is what we celebrate. This is what we ponder. And this is what motivates us as disciples as we seek to follow Jesus in this time, whether we see it as ordinary time or epiphany, a time like all times when God is revealing God's self to us. I pray that you will see God revealing God's self to you, and that you will work to reveal God to others during this time. Amen.